Good morning, everybody. Our share today is titled, Where are the First Chassidic Texts? And I've drawn from the absolutely groundbreaking research of Dr. Eli Mosesen, who examines the early manuscript tradition of Hasidism, because we know that the first Chassidic book ever printed was a work called Toldot Yaakov Yosef, which is a book that I proudly have over here in my library. It looks like a new print, but if you look inside, it's very much the old style printing. It's just like a new covering. So this was the first Chassidic book ever to be printed, Toldot Yaakov Yosef. It was written by Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya and published in 1780. Now that date is significant because we know that the Baal Shem Tov passed away in 1760, so 20 years after the passing of the Baal Shem Tov, we have the first printed book, which is Toldot Yaakov Yosef, as you have seen. But this opens up a whole lot of questions, because now what happened in the interim between the passing of the Baal Shem Tov and the printing of Toldot Yaakov Yosef, the first Chassidic book? And we're going to see now, we're going to be exposed to a very strange, murky world of early Chassidic manuscripts. We're going to look at what they were, who wrote them, what happened to them, and it's an absolutely fascinating story. So that's why I say this is groundbreaking research. In fact, this research is from 2026, which means it's fresh and it is brand new research. Now, Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya was a student of the Baal Shem Tov. And until now, for most scholars, and certainly for Chassidim, this book was the go-to book for the beginning of the Chassidic written tradition, because it was the first printed book. But nobody had ever really gone in great detail through the manuscript tradition. It has been overlooked in scholarship until now. And it's a pity, because this manuscript tradition reveals a fascinating window into the origins and the beginnings of the Chassidic movement. Because we see that the texts that floated around at that time, or the texts that emerged at that time, they were not a unified body. What the later Chassidim did, and the later Rebbes all did, is they projected this image that there was this monolithic structure with direct line from the Baal Shem Tov going through the Maggid of Mezrich, and then whichever Rebbe you were to your particular line. But it was clean, it was clear, it was authoritative, it was structured. But that's not the picture that emerges when one looks at the actual documentary evidence from that period, from that 20-year period between the passing of Baal Shem Tov, 1760, and the first Chassidic book, 1780. Now, it's strange that Toldot Yaakov Yosef should be the first Chassidic book to be published. The reason why I say that is because there's not much evidence that his writings had circulated, or that his writings were even popular or even known. Which brings us back to the old story that we've been speaking about in our recent talks, where with Jewish tradition in general, the printed tradition just in general, even before the era of the Hasidim, whoever managed to get his work to the printing house first won and assumes a dominant role in Jewish tradition. We saw this with the publication of the Shulchan Aruch, we saw this with the publication of soup commentaries on Rashi, etc., etc. We've dealt with this before. But we haven't dealt with this yet when it came to the Chassidic tradition. But the truth of the matter is that it seems to be a universal truth. He who publishes first wins, becomes dominant, and historically gets reflected, or they sort of project back onto the first published work, the great authority. That obviously the reason why that book was printed first was because he was the greatest person and the most popular person at the time. But the record, it doesn't show that. And that's why it becomes so interesting and so important to go into this early record, this early manuscript record. So we're making a very clear distinction between the printing record from 1780 onwards, where we have a printed record, but also there's this manuscript record for the 20 years before that. The interesting thing is that even after these Chassidic books became printed, in other words, even after 1780, the manuscript tradition still continued to thrive, and they were still writing and still circulating manuscripts even well after 1780. So this was clearly a considered body of literature, but we don't know much about it today, which is a shame. So this is a fascinating backdrop, I think, to some important questions that we need to ask. What was the first Chassidic text? Where is the first Chassidic text? Where is the first extant Chassidic text? What was the content of these texts? And to what extent did the printing tradition take over and reshape the actual history as we find recorded in the manuscript record? And the manuscript record reveals a literary world that is fragmented and contested, contradictory, and almost in a state of chaos, which is completely at odds with the way the Hasidic movement, in all its formulations and with all its various sects, chooses to present itself to their public. All right, let's begin. What is the first reference? Now, not what are the first Hasidic writings. Here our question is, what is the first reference to the existence of Hasidic writings in general? I'm just closing the door before my dog starts to bark. Okay, so where do we find the first references to the existence of Hasidic manuscripts or Hasidic writings in general? So this is a fundamental question, a very important question. Now, the answer is extremely ironic because it doesn't come from the Hasidim. The first reference to the existence of this brand new genre of Hasidic writings is to be found in the anti-Hasidic writings of the mitnagdim, of the opponents to the Hasidic movement, generally under the guardianship of the Vilna Gaon. And this book is called, it's a document, it's called Zemer Aritzim V'Charvot Tzurim, which means the cutting down of the mighty. The Hasidim, we were going to cut them down, and the ruins of strongholds, we're going to ruin all the strongholds and destroy the strongholds of the new Hasidic movement. So Zemer means to trim or to cut down, Aritzim, the mighty. Now in Zemer Aritzim, we find the following. The Hasidic Rebbe Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, he dies in 1788. He seeks a meeting with the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon refuses to see him. And the Vilna Gaon states that he is opposed to this new emergent Hasidic movement. And to quote from Zemer Aritzim, he says, because he is in possession of an exposition of a passage of the Zohar composed by that means the Hasidim, their faction, which contained heretical views. So basically, he's opposed to this movement because he regards this movement as being heretical. Okay, this is already well known. We know this already from the Vilna Gaon. But in this document, Zemer Haritzim, it's the first time that we see that there are writings, because the Vilna Gaon references these writings. He came across a certain Pirish on the Zohar. It doesn't matter what it's about, but he came across Chassidic writings and he found these writings to be heretical. So now we know that Chassidic writings, Chassidic manuscripts existed. Now there must have been a considerable body of this literature. It wasn't a one-off thing, like you found one document. There must have been a considerable body of literature, because the Vilna Gaon goes on to say that he's going to confiscate all their books. That means the manuscripts, because we're talking before the printed works came out. He's going to, but the manuscripts are also called books, but they're handwritten books. So he's going to confiscate all these manuscripts, because he finds, to quote Zemer Haritzim, he finds strange writings that cannot be written about openly. So he can't even speak about what he saw. But he saw terrible things, and therefore he's going to confiscate their writings. So now we see here, there are writings, again, another reference to writings, and they're writing about strange things. There's two references, they use the word writings, ketavim, twice in that one sentence. So there obviously was a body of literature that already had emerged. Zemer Haritzim comes out in 1772. Now, we know that on Friday, the 1st of May, 1772, which is interesting, it's like a kind of a Chassidic May Day or a Mitnagdic May Day, as it were. But anyway, on that date, just before Shabbos, in Vilna, under the instruction of the Vilna Gaon, all these writings are gathered. So once again, now we have a large corpus of Chassidic literature that we know nothing about, or we don't know much about. But the Vilna Gaon knew much about it, and people knew much about it, and they had gathered these writings, as many writings as they could find. They took them to the courtyard of the main shul in Vilna, just before Shabbos, and they burnt them. Big bonfire, and they burnt the earliest records of Hasidic writings. They were destroyed, they were burnt in an intentional fire under the instruction of the Vilna Gaon, Erev Shabbos, May 1. And the vehemence of this opposition and the drastic steps that they were prepared to take to destroy holy writings just shows how substantial and influenced these writings must have been, and how prevalent they must have been, and how widespread they must have been, and what a big fire there must have been. So now, that's our first reference. So now we know that by 1772, 12 years after Baal Shem Tov passes away, there's a considerable body of manuscript material. Now, we need to now begin to hypothesize and speculate what was this material? What was its style? Where did it come from predominantly, or was it just haphazard and random Hasidic collections? So, according to Moseson's research, it seems that they were not the writings of Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya. They were not the manuscript writings before this book was printed 8 years later in 1780. They were not. Which again shows that this book, the first Hasidic book that everyone regards as the go-to book for the beginnings of the Hasidic movement, don't appear even to have been popular. He just seemed to have won the battle, who gets to the printing house first. But the writings that were burnt and the writings that were destroyed and the writings that were popular and disseminated, throughout the whole world at that time, don't appear to be the writings of that first book. Don't appear to be of Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya, who was a student of the Baal Shem Tov. No, they weren't from him. They were apparently, predominantly, obviously, nothing ever fits into that category, but they were predominantly, certainly according to Moseson, the writings of the Maggid of Mezrich. Now we have to be careful. When we say the writings of anybody in this period, we don't really have writings of the people themselves or the great players. We know that the Maggid didn't write anything. So we talk about the writings of the Maggid of Mezrich. He didn't sit down and write. He was a prodigious speaker. He would give talks, and people would listen to his talks. Then his students would transcribe those talks. They would write them down. And the different students had different collections, and then eventually this collection grew and grew and grew. And that's what we refer to sort of collectively as the writings of the Maggid of Mezrich. But they're not from the Maggid of Mezrich. They are transcriptions by the students of the Maggid of Mezrich. The Maggid of Mezrich, of course, was a close disciple of the Baal Shem Tov. Next in line, according to most understanders of Chassidic history, next in line in the great dynasty. The problem is that these transcriptions of the Maggid's talks were ascribed to him. As the people writing them, and as you go further down in Jewish history, when these books eventually were printed, the title pages used to then say, these are the writings of the Maggid of Mezrich. So we have to be careful that we don't fall into the trap of considering those attributions as necessarily being accurate or authentic, because we know that the students did the transcription, and it was completely an irregulated enterprise. There was a lot of material, but there's no real oversight, no editorial board, as it were, to determine what's in and what's out. Everybody wrote. Everybody was writing the teachings of the Maggid. All his students were writing them down. So this is what Moses suggests, that the vast majority of the literature that was burnt in the fire in Vilna probably came from the genre of the Maggid, from the school of the Maggid, not from Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya, the first book, but from the Maggid of Mezrich. Right. Now, let's move on a little bit. So we know the first time Chassidic writings are alluded to. They are alluded to and mentioned in Zemer Aritzim, which resulted in the fire. Now, going down further in the line of Jewish history, the next reference to writings of the Chassidim, this time comes from the camp of the Chassidim. It's in 1777. Now, look at the dates. This is a long time now after the Baal Shem Tov. It's a long time. And when we're talking about something like the birth of the Chassidic movement and the turmoil and the impact that it had, and the new teachings, waiting so long until these teachings are referenced, never mind recorded, is a considerable period of time, which means we don't really know what was going on during this murky period. It was a murky period. And we need to understand that. But nonetheless, the first reference by the Chassidim to Chassidic writings is found in two letters that were written by Meshulam Feibish Heller, who was a student of the Maggid of Mezrich. They were later published anonymously in Likutei Yekarim, which came out in 1792. But the letters were written in 1777. And in those letters, Meshulam Feibish Heller writes that he met the Maggid once. He was a student, maybe a student of his, but he only met you. Probably better to refer to him as an associate of the Maggid. But he met him only once. But he eventually collected plenty writings, copious writings from the Maggid. And to quote from his letters, he says that he had eventually amassed the holy writings containing his words, which came into my possession. So he obviously was a collector of sorts of the writings of the Maggid. He had met him once, but he was inspired by him, and he made it his project to collect the writings of the Maggid of Mezrich. And these writings, these ketavim, are cited frequently throughout the letters, once again indicating that by 1777, this manuscript tradition or these writings were dominant and were prominent and had already been well established and experienced considerable circulation within the Jewish world. All right, let's go a little bit further now. Now we go to 1781. Okay, obviously in 1780, Toldet Yaakov Yosef gets published, but that doesn't seem to really tell us much because his works don't seem to have been popular. He just published first. But it seems that the next book that really reflected the Chassidic genres of the time was a year later in 1781. 1781, we have the publication of Magid Dvarav LeYaakov. Also the teachings now of the Magid of Mezrich. Don't confuse Yaakov for Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya. This was now the Magid of Mezrich. So Magid Dvarav LeYaakov is a collection of books, a collection of writings, allegedly from the Magid of Mezrich. This was published in Kotzk by Shlomo of Lutsk. He was the publisher. I don't know if he was the printer, but he was certainly the publisher. And it's called Magid Dvarav LeYaakov. Magid, obviously an allusion to the Magid of Mezrich and teaching to Jacob, the house of Israel, indicating also that this was a work, teachings for the Jewish people. It was not just for a sect, it was for the Jewish people. And the title page of this book, the Sharblat, indicates that these are the direct teachings of the Magid. So if you would pick up this book, Magid Dvarav LeYaakov, published in 1781, and you read the Sharblat, and you would believe the Sharblat, and you wouldn't think that you shouldn't believe the Sharblat. You think, oh, goodness, here we have a fantastic collection of the writings of the Magid of Mezrich. And it also says that these writings were published with the endorsement of the Magid of Mezrich. So again, once again, if you're reading this, you can think, well, this is a fantastic find. Here we have, for the first time, a historical record of the actual teachings of the Magid, if not authored by the Magid of Mezrich. There's only one problem. The Magid of Mezrich passed away 9 years earlier. So if he did endorse it, if he would have done it a long time earlier, it seems rather unlikely, but I mean, it still could be. So Shlomo of Lutsk writes this in the Sharblat, and he also writes that the writings had been extensively copied, hand copied, and he acknowledges in his introduction, now this is no longer on the Sharblat. You often find differences between the title page and then the introduction, and then the approbations of the Haskamot, as we shall soon see. Sometimes in the same book, they all tell completely different stories. Because remember, in those days, printing and writing was and editing wasn't developed the way it's developed now. So in his introduction, he says that he's drawn from a number of, again, ketavim, a number of writings. From a number of writers, which is interesting. So it seems to be contradicting what he's saying on the title page, that these are the writings of the Magid. He's kind of saying that published with his endorsement, but in the introduction he's drawn, maybe he means also drawn. It gets a little bit foggy, but he certainly says he's taking again from a reference to the Ketavim. So that there's this mystical, elusive body of writings that we don't know much about, from an elusive body of writers, which he acknowledges in his introduction. All right, then a couple of years later, in 1792, another book comes out, because they now discover further teachings of the Magid of Mezrich. So now, no longer is Magid Dvarav LeYaakov sufficient to contain the writings of the Magid of Mezrich, but with the passage of time, we have more writings that are attributed to him, to the Magid. And by the way, you find this with all the Chassidim. We find this with the Kotzk Rebbe. There's something like 2,000 aphorisms attributed to him. And books, I've got 3 books that I always thought they were written by the Kotzk Rebbe, but he didn't write anything. But according to some of the research, he may have only authored something like, he may have only actually, let me rephrase it, maybe only 13 of those 2,000 odd teachings can accurately be shown to have emerged from him. And none of them were particularly significant. They were sometimes just comments on the weather, which is very strange. But the point I'm trying to make is, as you go down further in Hasidic history, the collections become bigger. They always become bigger. People finding more writings, and the attributions always go back to the most important individual, and they become ascribed to him. And that's exactly what's happened now with another book that came out, Likutei Yekarim, a collection of treasured teachings, which was based on new material that had surfaced since the publication of Magid Rav Yaakov. We have further teachings of the Magid, and this again confirms that there was a large corpus of writings, because they had now found more writings. And obviously by this time, these would have been writings that would have survived the fire of 1772 that the Vilna Gaon had created in Vilna to burn the Hasidic writings. So this is now a second collection, Likutei Yekarim, 1792, but also allegedly from the Magid. And in the Haskamot, the approbations, where people write little things saying that they authorized this book. A disciple of the Magid of Mezrich, Yisachar Ber of Zlotsov, confirms that they had found new pamphlets. So that's, for our purposes, very interesting, because these pamphlets, these Kutresim, these writings, these Ketavim, it was a large corpus. It was floating around, and again, we don't know much about it, but it was there. Kutresim Chadashim, he refers to it, new pamphlets that had subsequently surfaced. Obviously, we don't know much about this. So when were they written? What's their provenance? We don't really know, but they certainly surfaced. In another Haskama, another approbation to Likutei Yekarim, another disciple of the Magid. And again, you could see how this movement was fractured, because everybody was speaking with a voice of authority. Everybody was the main disciple. You find this with the Arizal as well. Everybody was his main disciple. So now you have another disciple of the Magid of Mezrich here, and that's Avram Chaim of Zlotsov. So Yisachar Ber and Avram Chaim both had approbations, and they both came from Zlotsov. He dies in 1816. But anyway, he similarly notes that the practice of the students of the Magid was to transcribe the teachings, and I quote, for preservation, each person according to his understanding. Now that sentence is pregnant with meaning. It's an acknowledgement that the Magid didn't write himself. He didn't write anything himself. And that what we know about him came through students. But what we see over here is each person according to his understanding, which is a tacit endorsement to the notion that you're going to have different writings, different schools and different thoughts are going to be emerging, all in the name of the Magid of Mezrich, each person according to his understanding. And everybody is writing, but everybody has different understanding. So now we have writings that are often in conflict with each other that emerge from the same schools. And these manuscripts circulated for years. As I mentioned, even after the printing of the first Chassidic text, so even after 1780, and even here after the 1790s, because Likutei Yekarim was published in 1792. But we're still having Kutresim Chadashim, we're still having new writings that were still floating around well into the era of the printed Chassidic works. Okay, what's the first extant Chassidic manuscript? Now, this doesn't mean that we know what the first Chassidic manuscript was, because we don't. But what is the earliest extant manuscript that we have? So again, this is no indication as to the age of Chassidic manuscripts. It's how far does our record go? And the first Chassidic manuscript is to be found in the National Library of Israel. But the date is interesting, at 1776. which is quite a while before 1792 when Likutei Yekarim, the second version of the writings of the Maggid, was published. But what's interesting about our first extant Chassidic manuscript from 1776 is that we see that it was based on several earlier manuscripts. So the tradition goes way earlier, way before 1776. There were lots of manuscripts. And again, we have evidence of considerable circulation of these texts. And we see that they would have surfaced. This is 1776 is 4 years before before Toldet Yaakov Yosef, the first printed Chassidic work. They have been distributed to a large extent and had quite a considerable readership in the world before the printed Chassidic book. Now, Moses's research into this murky world of the early Chassidic manuscript has to reshape Chassidic history, and it does. Until now, as I mentioned, most Chassidim and even scholars would have regarded the printed book, Toldet Yaakov Yosef, as the first stop, the first evidence of Chassidic writing. So there was a first printed. But we see now that you need to go way earlier, 20 years earlier. During that 20 years before this book came out, there was this genre. Half the stuff had been burnt. There were numerous writers. Everybody's referencing it, and we know nothing about it. And our record is only from 1776, but again, referencing that there were plenty of writings before that. So it was a big world of manuscripts that we know absolutely nothing about, one of the most important modern movements within Judaism. The early record has essentially vanished, partially destroyed by the Vilna Gaon, partly rewritten by later Hasidic rabbis because everybody wanted to show that the line went on to, but we don't really know what happened. So until now, people assumed without qualification that you can go to Toldet Yaakov Yosef to find the earliest teachings of the Hasidic doctrine. But we know now that there was an extensive, unregulated enterprise taking place before that. It seems as if the early Hasidic writings, were predominantly, now I would have thought they would have been predominantly teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, but we're not even blessed to have a substantial genre of teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. It's all been lost, which is a shame because that's where we really need to go. But the Ketavim that we're referring to now were generally revolving around the Maggid of Mezrich. It's a second generation, which again is a pity because we don't have access to the first generation. We don't even have access to the second generation, but we know now that this corpus existed, but the corpus really grew when it came to the writings of the Maggid, not the Baal Shem Tov, second in line. So our teachings are now second hand, and even that's murky. We have a collection of 15 manuscripts that are connected to the Maggid of Mezrich. 15 manuscripts. The problem is that only 2 of these 15 manuscripts relating to the teachings of the Maggid of Mezrich now, only 2 of them claim to be the teachings of the Maggid of Mezrich. And even those, so the other 13 don't even claim to be of the Maggid of Mezrich. They contain material of the Maggid, but only 2 claim to be the exclusive material of the Maggid. But even those don't make their claim of exclusivity. They say it's the teachings of the Maggid, but not exclusively, because demonstrably they show teachings from other people. They're quoting other people as well. So even those that claim to be most closely connected to the writings of the Maggid of Mezrich are again exposed to this murky world of having anonymous writers contributing as well, people who we don't know because their names aren't mentioned, and even other names are mentioned, so it's clearly not just from the school of the Maggid of Mezrich. And even some people refer to the writings as Yisachar Ber, not of Dovber. So it seems as if some of the people didn't even get the name of the Maggid correct. They may have confused him with someone else, because there was someone else by that name. But they couldn't even get his name right. So it just shows you how fluid this corpus of writing actually was. Now let's look at one particular case. Part of the circle of the Maggid of Mezrich was Tzvi Hirsch of Nadvona. He dies in 1802. And Tzvi Hirsch of Nadvona frequently quotes from this manuscript corpus. You know, it's this collection of 15 manuscripts connected to the Maggid of Mezrich. And he calls them ha'atakot, which means the copies or the transcriptions. So clearly these 15 manuscripts were regarded, or they're held in high esteem. They even had a name, ha'atakot, the copies. And he mentions ha'atakot 40 times. Tzvi Hirsch of Nadvona. He mentions these ha'atakot 40 times in his writings. But he does not credit them to his teacher, the Maggid of Mezrich. So this is just evidence that the writings that were considered to be accurate writings from the Maggid of Mezrich, a close disciple of the Maggid who references these writings doesn't attribute those writings to his teacher, which is a fascinating piece of evidence. It just shows how wary we have to be when we hear that someone says in the name of the Maggid. Are they saying it in the name of the Maggid, or are they just attributing it like everybody was doing it, pegging it, hanging it on a peg, a choshev, a peg, hanging on the peg of the Maggid of Mezrich. And to complicate matters further, Tzvi Hirsch of Nadvona's son, okay, that's the same person's son, also mentions these ha'atakot that his father had collected and referenced, but he refrains from connecting them to the Maggid of Mezrich whatsoever. There's not even, it's not even from the family of the Maggid of Mezrich. So his own son, he obviously heard from his father, and he wasn't prepared to attribute these teachings to the Maggid. They were Chassidic teachings, but he wasn't prepared to attribute them to the Maggid. And once again, the Maggid is already second from the Baal Shem Tov. Instead, what he reframes it completely, and he was, you've got to give him credit for this because he was being rather accurate. Instead of saying, no, they all come from the Maggid of Mezrich, we know 100% everything's fine. He says, no, they're holy transmissions, holy writings, transcribed by the great ones among the righteous and the pious, and the pious, I'm quoting, both early and later. All he does is that they came from great people. He doesn't even mention them by name, so they're anonymous in this reference. So this great corpus that people think are the authentic writings of the Maggid of Mezrich, by the time we get to Aryeh Leib, David Aryeh Leib, who's the son of Tzvi Hirsch of Nadvona, who specialized in the teachings of the Maggid, the son, is referring to these as just great writings from great people, early and later. In other words, it's generational. It's taken from many generations, and he doesn't name them. So they're anonymous, and we don't know where they fit in time. So for people who would have considered that source to be the source for writings of the Maggid, it doesn't seem to be an accurate source to go to. And once again, I just want to mention that we have to be careful of falling into the trap of presentism. As we've seen now, presentism is where we're living in 2026 now, when we attribute something to someone in writing, and if something gets published, it's usually relatively accurate, or it's supposed to be accurate. And one expects, when one sees the name of an author, that's the author. But this is a slightly more modern understanding of authorial boundaries. What are the boundaries of an author? In those days, if you're a student or a second cousin and a friend of of a student and you said something in the name of someone without proper quotations, without proper referencing, you could still say that it comes from the Baal Shem Tov. Much like our oral tradition in our world today, when we give over words and things like that. We say something I heard from someone say, as long as you mention the person's name, everyone thinks it's accurate. So we must be careful that we don't fall into this trap of presentism if we want to do an accurate study of the origins of Chassidic writing. Now, our next question is, who are the transcribers? Because we've had a few references already to the transcribers. Again, we're not even with the Baal Shem Tov. This is the Maggid of Mezrich, second generation. Who are the transcribers of the Maggid of Mezrich? Now things start getting very interesting. Shlomo Lutzk, who published the first book on the Maggid of Mezrich, Maggid of Rav Yaakov, writes that the transcribers were the students of the Maggid. So that's good. That's accurate. I mean, that means that we can assume that the students of the Maggid would be accurate. But the problem is, he doesn't name them. He doesn't name them. So we don't know who they are. We don't know who they were. We don't even know if he was accurate. He might have just had a transition that came from the Talmidei Maggid, but he doesn't name them. So traditions started to develop. Who were these transcribers? So he doesn't name them. So now the next generation comes along. Okay, so we'll name them. So a tradition emerged that the first Rebbe of Chabad was one of the main students of the Maggid. And again, every Hasidic group claimed that their Rebbe was the main student. And Chabad did no different. But Chabad developed a larger corpus of literature and made this claim more authoritatively more often. And that's why it's generally considered to be the case. But we're going to talk about this in a moment. So there is a Hasidic tradition that one of the students of the Maggid was indeed the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the first Chabad Rebbe, but that he was the main transcriber of the teachings of the Maggid. So according to this tradition, again, I'm not saying it's true, I'm not saying it's not true, but according to this tradition, thanks to the first Rebbe of Chabad, we now have an accurate understanding and a window into the mind of the Maggid of Mezrich, who obviously had a window into the mind of the Baal Shem Tov. So this is quite a strong Hasidic tradition, something I've come across over the years many times. There's one or two problems with this tradition, with the way this tradition is framed, because we know, and we can talk about this later as well, that Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the first Chabad Rebbe, and he wrote a lot. He wrote a fortune of books. That is for sure. He has a very extensive and also a very innovative literary corpus. He was very innovative. He seems to reference the Maggid to show authoritative connection, but he doesn't quote much from the Maggid of Mezrich. So his writings are more chidushim, they're more innovative. And he appears to supplant the Hasidic line and to start a new line from himself. Because he only occasionally quotes his master, the Maggid of Mezrich. And he does seem to have been intent upon starting a new movement, issuing directives to his students and to the new movement, breaking away and shying away also from references to other Hasidic writings. I remember this as well in my earlier years in Chabad. If I wanted to read writings of other Hasidic Rebbes, it was often frowned upon because one should only take from the line of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. And Rabbi Shneur Zalman hardly ever quoted from A, the Maggid, as I mentioned, and B, from the earlier Chassidic corpus. So most of his writings are his own writings. He rarely mentioned these other people. And even later, Chassidic or Chabad Rebbes who came after him followed the same pattern. They mentioned the Alter Rebbe, they mentioned Rabbi Shneur Zalman, but they also didn't quote copiously from the wider Chassidic tradition. So they were keen on funneling down the teachings, or sometimes maybe not funneling, although because they don't really quote much in the funnel, but certainly focusing their own teachings into a specific line. And that seems to be the actual intent. And we'll talk about this later when we come to the Chesed Geniza, because it was a pattern that was followed by other Rebbes as well, which we could demonstrate if we have time a little bit later. There are also indications that Rabbi Shneur Zalman may have not just unintentionally left out the other Chassidim, but he may have, you can see I'm choosing my words very carefully. There are indications that he may have actively censored general Chassidic literature. And where do we see this? We see this in his own writings. Now, during the 1790s, he was receiving visitors. For some reason, he seems to be referencing young people coming. He seems to have attracted quite a lot of young people. But the young visitors to his court were bringing with them, and I quote now, writings and transcriptions, ha'atakot. There we have that word again, ha'atakot, which seems to be the word that's used to describe this manuscript, this murky manuscript tradition, ha'atakot. So now the young people are coming to his court and they're probably so excited. We got teachings, and it might come from the Baal Shem Tov, might come from the Maggid. They're so excited, thinking the Alter Rebbe is going to fall over backwards. But he's not interested. He doesn't want the ha'atakot. He doesn't want them. He doesn't want to publicize them. He doesn't want to even perpetuate them. He wants his own teachings. He wants to start a new movement. And they're bringing the hatakot, and again I quote, of words of Hasidim, both new and old, which implies that maybe even teachings going back to the Baal Shem Tov, certainly to the Maggid, and even to some of the other Rebbes who are competing with Alter Rebbe as to who's going to take over the Hasidic movement. So they've got all these collections, and they appear to be, again, a large corpus that had survived the fire in 1772. This is the 1790s. Maybe there's even new material, because we know that they carried on writing. So there was a kind of a secondary corpus of these manuscripts that had developed, and people were keen to bring them to Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. Instead, they were met with the following statement, and this is recorded in Igrot Kodesh, which you can look up, of the Alter Rebbe, on page 254. And he writes there that the young people are bringing in these new hatakot from the Hasidim, both new and old. They've got these writings in their possession. So we can see clearly now there's a big corpus that has been collected by multiple people, and they're coming to him now. And he wanted to inform all his people. Alter Rebbe now informs all his people, young and old, and even people who are not his people, to quote from him. In other words, non-Chabad people, that they must bring in their writings to him, if you read the letter, he says that you can write your name on it, but you have to hand it in to what he calls his Beis Din, his court. And they will be checked. And then, obviously, if they're deemed okay, they'll be returned to the person with his name on. But we have no evidence of how much material was returned. It doesn't mean none of it was returned. But certainly there was a process of censorship, or in his words, checking to see what was going on. So these writings had to be handed in. And to show how serious this enterprise was, you had to take an oath. You had to swear that you were handing everything in. So you weren't keeping anything in your private collection at home. Everything had to be handed in. And you had to inform on other people you knew of who may have had writings as well. I mean, this is an inquisition. This is a Chassidic inquisition. We will check your material under oath. You have to hand them in. You may get them back, but they will be checked. They will be vetted. Now, obviously, people are going to turn around and say, well, there was so much writing, and they want to make sure it was okay. Maybe. Well, when you look at the bigger picture, and especially look at the history and some of the evidence we'll bring from the Ches and Geniza, there does appear, and again, I'm choosing my words very carefully over here, to be some kind of control, a limiting of influence, quite literally from the Baal Shem Tov and even the Maggid, because he hardly mentions them, and focusing on a new type of authoritative Hasidism, but using the line of transmission through the Maggid to the Baal Shem Tov as the cement that holds everything together, keeping it well within the boundaries of the Hasidic movement. From this letter, and you can read it yourself, there does seem to be an inquisitional tenor, more than the desire to eliminate errors for the future, because he was not really concerned about the outside literature of the other Hasidic rebels, and even of the two masters who had preceded him. All right, so we were talking about the tradition that one of the transcribers of the Maggid was Rabbi Shneur Zalman. Based on what we've just seen now, it seems highly unlikely that Rabbi Shneur Zalman would have wanted to simply perpetuate the writings of the Maggid. He rather wanted to be innovative, come up with Chidushim, and develop a new system of Chabad, which he did extremely successfully. But he doesn't seem to have been, his project does not seem to have been one of collecting the writings of his teachings, of his teacher, and spreading the writings of his teacher. He was spreading his own teachings. So we can eliminate, to some extensive degree, I think, the tradition that Rabbi Shneur Zalman was one of these anonymous transcribers, or one of the transcribers of the tradition of the Maggid. Other people say it was Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, so the traditions are quite wide open. We can see in all these examples, no one really knows what was going on, because the transcribers remained essentially anonymous. So an already weak corpus of literature with anonymous transcribers is not great material. And it was shaped by many hands over many decades. And then all of a sudden, 1780s, the books get published, and all of a sudden there's a new picture that emerges. Oh no, there's a straight line of transmission. Everything is accurate. People are writing things. The Maggid wrote things. These are actually the books of the Maggid, etc., etc. But that picture is not an accurate picture if one looks at the period, this murky period that we're looking at right now. In fact, the contrary emerges. Instead of being an authoritative line, the evidence, the textual evidence and the historical evidence shows that the Chassidic line the Chassidic line was not a centralized line. In Chabad and in other groups, it's painted as being very simple. Baal Shem Tov, Magid, Alter Rebbe, and then 7 lines of Rebbes. Never mind successive battles within the Chassidic movement as well, numerous succession battles where the movement adopted different names and formed a hybrid of Chabad, Lubavitch, but there was Staroselia, Kotzk, and all sorts of other movements as well, and people broke away, and each group thought they were exactly in a line. But the picture is always painted as a straight, authoritative, monolithic structure. But the evidence doesn't point in that direction. The evidence points rather to a decentralized pattern of the spreading of Hasidic teachings, where each Rebbe became autonomous, and the groups became autonomous, even during the lifetime of people like the Maggid of Mezrich, which is a fascinating view. And this is why I say that this research, I think, significantly reshapes Hasidic history. I want to talk about one book, just to begin concluding. One book that received considerable attention, that may show us how different early Hasidism was in its manuscript form, and how different the Hasidic movement is portrayed today by every group of Hasidim. Because the early group of Hasidim must have had something contentious. And I'm not even going into Sabbatianism right now, because we've dealt with that on numerous occasions. But there was something else that the Hasidic movement had, that the later Rebbes and the later writers, and particularly the printed authors, if they were actually authors, or the printed collections to be more accurate, were trying to steer away from. So what was it? What was it in that early manuscript tradition that we can reconstruct to the best of our ability, that caused the books to be burnt by the Vilna Gaon, and that even caused internal Hasidic censorship, as we saw with Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Alter Rebbe? What was it? Or what was one of the components? Because there appeared to be a number of components, because there were so many different hands over so many different decades, so many different branches. But what was a dominant theme that seemed to get the Hasidim into trouble without touching upon Sabbatianism? What was it that the later Rebbes and the later printed tradition were trying to hide, if that's too strong a word, reshape? But we still have echoes of it today. This is absolutely fascinating. So, our printed tradition, starts with Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya. Just to recap, 1760 we have our first printed book. Then we come out with Magid Devar Yaakov on the Magid, 1781, which is a year later. Then 1792, which is 11 years later, we got a year later in 1781 we get Likutei Yekarim also on the Magid, and then in 1792, which is 11 years later, we get Tzavat Merivash. They start even getting more accurate, bringing teachings of the Baal Shem Tov into it. And by that stage, the printed world is retroactively claiming attribution to the great Hasidic masters, either the Baal Shem Tov or the Maggid of Mezrich. But as we have seen, that's impossible. It's impossible. By the time we get to the 1800s, even it becomes impossible, because they couldn't even do it in the generations when those leaders were actually alive themselves. But the printed works show a different picture. So here's one example in 1805. So now this is way after, well into the period when the printed work is established, and everyone's attributing it authoritatively to all the great Hasidic leaders, without doubt. So we have one particular book that comes out, 1805, Darkei Yesharim. Now, allegedly, Allegedly, and we have to use that word because unfortunately we have to use the word all the time when it comes to the so-called authors of these books, because many hands authored them and many of them were anonymous. But in this particular book, Darkei Yesharim, allegedly it's compiled by Menachem Mendel of Premislan, passed in 1772. Okay, so the book's printed in 1805. Menachem Mendel of Premislan died in 1772. Right, so already a long period of time between the 33 years earlier. But this book claims to be based on the teachings not just of the Maggid, but even more innovative, claiming to represent the teaching directly from the Baal Shem Tov, which very few people even did beforehand. It's called Darkei Yesharim, the ways of the righteous, allegedly by Menachem Mendel of Premislan. Now, let's just look at this book. This book, first of all, does appear to be an independent work, maybe not written by Menachem Mendel of Premislan, but it does appear to have sort of a textual cohesion, not many hands. So we've got to grant it. This book does appear to be a cohesive book. It also seems to be part of a larger work, parts of which had been lost because it's lost its textual integrity. And the other larger part seems to have spread throughout the rest of the Chassidic corpus. But the body does appear to be quite cohesive in itself. But what is interesting about this work is it appears to be quite substantially censored. So it's cohesive, yes, probably not written by Menachem Mendel of Premislan, but it is well censored, cohesive and well censored. In other words, a very well structured book with a large degree of censorship. And now the question is, what were they censoring? And there wasn't only censorship, where they left out bits. There was textual modification, which is where you break away from the cohesiveness of the writing style. So that's how we know that new material had been added. Certain passages, to quote Moseson, were deemed overly radical by a copyist or editor who decided to alter the text and render it less problematic. That's, again, a very nice way of describing this particular book, Darkei Yesharim. Now, what was problematic? So here we come to the crux. Early Hasidism appears to have been substantially different from later Hasidism in many ways, one way particularly, and that was in its focus on Dveikut. Dveikut is clinging to God, mystically clinging to God. The emphasis on Dveikut in the formative years of the Chassidic movement, when the movement really began, it was when Chassidic was really talking about what it was standing for, was a radical program of making Dveikut central to a new form of Judaism. In other words, everything else, our vast libraries, our emphasis on Shmirat HaMitzvot and all the different mitzvot, and the Shulchan Aruch and so many things. The Shulchan Aruch had recently been published in the 16th century. Everyone had access to the codification of the law. There was a fear that people were focusing too much on the codification of the law. So there was this poetic movement emerging, breaking away from the strictures of the law. We all know that. But the extent is not often dealt with. The extent to which they wish to break away from studying and break away from the law is alluded to, but nobody ever admits to the extent of that breakaway. And from the early manuscript tradition, the focus appears to be, and this is why we don't have record of it, because it was so highly censored and everybody wanted to remove this. In other words, they wanted to say the Chassidic movement is wonderful, it's brought so many things to to the table. There's so much we can learn from it. And yes, Judaism did need to have a kind of a Protestant Reformation in a sense. The Havdil Elef Abdullah, but we can't just get rid of the very radical stuff, and the radical references appear to hinge around the Veikut, which was a central theme in the early Chassidic. It wasn't just, everyone has to have a feeling of connected to God. It appears to have been, this was a raison d'etre. This is what it was about. It was experiential. It was an experiential process of mystically clinging to God. And to reach that level, you could sacrifice, and you could certainly pause your Torah study. So Torah study no longer became dominant. In the Jewish world before, Torah study was dominant, like it is in the religious world today. It's the be-all and the end-all. You don't stop it, but you could stop it. Not for little pockets of a little song and a little dance and a bit of Musa, a bit of Chassidus, like we do today, and a Fabringen. It was the focus. It was a larger focus than we think it was. And this focus on Dveikut, the clinging to God, was taken to a point that you could nullify the performance of the mitzvahs, Shmirat HaMitzvot. You could nullify your Talmud Torah, because this could be a distraction. In other words, listen carefully to this distinction. Not only is it a distraction, but it negates. It could work against the Veikut. In other words, too much study may not be good for the soul. It may push you in the opposite direction, even take you away from God, because you're too involved in your head. You've got to get more and more involved with your soul. So this emphasis on Dveikut was wonderful for people who were mystically inclined and people who saw what was going on in the Jewish world. Everybody was becoming ultra involved in the minutiae of Jewish law, and here you have a movement now that subordinated halachic observance to inward spiritual experience, which is wonderful for people who are that way inclined. But the movement appeared to have developed that to such an extent that the later Rebbes and anonymous writers extensively censored that out of the record that's already a murky record, and made it seem as if Dveikus existed, but not to that extent. And we'll take a bit of that Dveikus, but we'll apply it reasonably and relatively rationally. Our experientialism, we'll incorporate it into our schedule, but the schedule still is very much halacha related, Talmud Torah related, and we're keeping it well within the confines of the law. So you could say that this poor corpus of Chassidic teachings that had been burnt, that had been falsely attributed to other people, that had to be handed in to some Chassidic Rebbes for vetting, this poor corpus of our most authoritative teachings was now actively censored, even within the manuscript corpus itself. And this is fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. And what it did is the manuscript tradition, and certainly the later printed tradition even more, but all the later traditions actively censored the predominance of Dveikut in its early formulation, the way it was understood, not just as a lovely fuzzy feeling to aid you, but as being something that one actually works on to the detriment of possibly even halacha and Talmud Torah. Not only was it censored out, but listen what they did. They added new text. And that's why I said, you remember in Darkei Yesharim, it seems to be a comprehensive work, but you can see where there's something that breaks with their comprehensiveness. And very often the pattern is that what breaks with the comprehensiveness of a text like that is that you now find apologetic literature coming in. In other words, people are now within the Chassidic world now saying, oh, it's very important to study Torah. It's very important to do mitzvahs. And you've got to ask yourself, why? We know this. We've known this for hundreds of years already. We've been writing about it. Everybody knows. We are defined by halakha, and we defined by Shmiras HaMitzvahs. We defined by that. We wake up in the morning, we daven and we learn. Why all of a sudden now? And it come out of like a Vilna tradition even, where there's this tremendous focus. Although Vilna was also very Kabbalistic and very mystical and very messianic as well, which we spoke about. Anyway, we're not talking about that now. But there certainly was a focus within that world on this a strict commitment to the law. Why do you need the Chassidim now? To come say, no, it's very important to keep the Torah and to find time to study Torah and to do mitzvahs. We know this. And it's taken for granted. And this is like a strata of apologetic literature that gets built now into the manuscript text and certainly into the printed text. And you find this in Darkei Yesharim. So there's now new text that's been added. And you can see this layer of new text, where suddenly it becomes important to do the basic things that Jews have been doing for centuries. They're suddenly emphasizing it now. Why? Because they were negating it in the earlier literature. And they were emphasizing dveikut as a central and radical new form of Judaism that no one wants to speak about and no one wants to acknowledge today. And this censorship was not that the censorship, it was the adding of additional text as well, which was apologetic in its nature. So, for example, you find people say you've got to study Torah as much as possible, and you've got to be stringent. And this is why Chassidim is so fascinating to understand this. Because you can sometimes wonder, why do Chassidim have got such a wonderful approach, and they sing so nicely, and it's wonderful to be with them, and they're all so friendly. Why are they so machmir, and why do they have certain things like on Pesach, they go worse there than the other people. They go mad, they boil sugar, and why is this suddenly this like uber emphasis on the minutiae of the law? Because it's part of that apologetic genre to show where there was this need to show a breakaway, and that also may have been why people like the Alter Rebbe were quite innovative and wanted the other texts to be handed in. Hard to know exactly what was going through his mind, but one could imagine it was something like that, because these texts were described were highly apologetic, highly censored. And you know how we know this? There's evidence for what I'm saying. The earliest extant Chassidic manuscript that I referenced early on, that's in the National Library of Israel from 1776, has got two very interesting pieces of literature. One is it has what appears to be a censored version of a text, and then an uncensored version of the text. So if you study that manuscript, it looks as if the author of that manuscript first found a censored version, then found an uncensored version, and then included the uncensored version in and kept two versions in. Now, if you compare those two versions, it's very interesting. The censored version seems to be highly apologetic. That's the version that talks about the importance of, let's say, chumras, stringencies in the law, the importance of studying Torah, the importance of doing mitzvahs, but overly emphasizing it because it had to excise the earlier, censor out the earlier references to the Veikut, which is referenced in the uncensored version. And again, to quote Moses Simi, he says, we must not underestimate what this Dveikut was. And I absolutely agree with that, because he says it was one of the most radical and sustained, I quote from him, presentations of the ideal of Dveikut in Jewish history. In other words, nowhere before in Jewish history, not in the Kabbalists of Spain, not in the Zohar, not in Chassidic Ashkenaz, not in the later corpus of Lurani Kabbalah from the Arizal in 16th century Tzvat. Nowhere in all these formulations of Jewish mysticism do we have the notion of Dveikut. Maybe not in people like Abulafia, who had the most extreme, ecstatic form of mysticism, although I can't say that with a great degree of accuracy. He may have been more radical, I'm not sure. But this ranks among the most radical depictions of Dveikut. And that was what the Baal Shem Tov brought. And that was the chiddush of the Chassidic movement. And this is something that's not spoken about, not known about. It's almost completely censored out. And in fact, we've gone to the opposite direction to say, no, look at us. We're very, very conscious of observing mitzvahs, and we even show you how conscious we are. We're even more strict than you are because of the chumras that we keep with these mitzvot. So it seems that early formulation of Dveikut was so central that anything that interfered with it, whether in terms of time or even psychologically, in other words, even the way your mind worked, you had to eradicate. In other words, you even lose your mind for the experientialism. And this, to me, is something interesting, because if I can just add in brackets, and I know we've gone on a bit over here, but something I just want to touch on. We have today, within some of these movements, a return to this notion. I believe it's a return to this notion of Dveikut. It started off with an emphasis on alcohol. I once wrote an article called "Alcohol is the Drug That Keeps People From." It's even spilled over into the non-Chassidic world. Our communities are fueled by alcohol, and it's a tremendous problem. We don't acknowledge it. People leave shul completely inebriated. It affects families. But I used to think that was a problem. I see now that it's not a problem, based on my experience and people that I've met and people that I've spoken to, and many of my colleagues that I've discussed this with as well. We now have a new problem. It's a problem of a new need for experientialism through things like gummies and cactus tea and various other things, various other substances. And unfortunately, it's framed as being at a cutting edge of research. People tell me all the great professors are all doing this. Well, I can tell you, I spent 10 years in the company of many, many professors, and I never met one who actually even spoke about this or he even practiced things like this. But it's sold as this is the cutting edge. This is what's happening in the academic world. Well, it might be, but everybody's not doing it, and not all of them are taking it. And the great research, and this is the way the mind works, and this is the path of the future. In the meantime, all the people that I met, they can't even climb upstairs. They can't even park parallel anymore, and they can't even speak without shouting. So what I'm saying is that why they're doing this, a lot of all the people I'm talking about are extremely religious. Some of them not even Baalei Tshuva anymore. Completely enthralled by the Chassidic teachings. But instead of alcohol now, which is no longer enough, they want that experientialism even more. And they'll sacrifice anything, never mind Torah, even their families, to get to that dveikut. So I think I understand why the early Chassidic movement, I understand that it was focusing on this. We know that many of the Chassidic rebels also used to smoke pipes, and I'm not necessarily suggesting anything, because you could have dveikut without substances, perhaps. But I think I understand why there was this need to remove that intense need for experientialism because of the problems that it brought. But residues of that experientialism, I believe, kernels of that, still remain today and can be found within the Chassidic movement today and used within the Chassidic movement today. So I don't think it's just a turn to some form of addiction, or they'll tell you straight away, too, it's not an addiction. They'll tell you you're an ignoramus because you don't understand the value of this new scientific endeavor. Well, that's fine. But their behavior is not indicative of such a wonder. And they all get consciousness. They all get clarity, great clarity, but they can't remember where they live. They can't remember where they stay. And they sometimes forget to eat and go to the bathroom. So where the clarity comes from, I don't know. But these are people raised within this culture where there is an emphasis on experientialism. Now, the question is, where do you stop that experientialism? So it starts out first, you want to have a nice feeling when you daven and you've got a personal God. God's listening to every word of your tefillahs. And God actually wants our tefillahs. So it starts off like that. It's quite manan. Then you have a l'chaim that helps. And afterwards, alcohol is not enough. A couple of bottles of alcohol are not enough. And then you've got to move on to proper experience for you to get that great clarity. Now, again, I'm jumping a little bit, I don't know exactly about the parallelism about everything that I'm saying, but I do see some kind of a conversation taking place with this need for experientialism. And I believe that something like this may have been going on, not necessarily substance related. It may have been practices of the mind. I don't know. I really don't know. But something like this, to some extent, was going on, and they had to reshape and redefine the essence of Chassidic experientialism, which is why that mystical, that manuscript corpus became so murky. It was destroyed in fires by people like the Vilna Gaon, who saw things he can't even write about. And it was censored even by some of the Chassidic Rebbes, as we have seen, where writings had to be handed in under oath and people had to be informed on. So it appears that something like this was being hidden, this extra, this omni-significant need to have experiential. So anyway, that's all I have to say about this very fascinating corpus of literature that not too many people have studied before. What was taking place between 1760 and 1780 when the first Chassidic book was printed. Once this book came out in 1860, although it's not representative of the Great Corpus. Great Corpus was more from the Maggid, not from Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya. But once this book came out, Hasidism suddenly became very easy to understand, redefined. Lines of transmission were easily explained away by people who were creating dynasties and wanted to show that their dynasty was in fact the next in line. And the whole essence of what the Chassidic movement was about and its literature was no longer available for us because it had been destroyed, it had been censored, and it had been lost to time. But people who are prepared to go and try and research further into those 20 years between 1760 and 1780 and focus not on what they told happened retroactively by later, especially the printed traditions, but to try as much as one can explore further this fascinating world of Hasidic manuscripts. So to answer the question, what are the first Hasidic manuscripts? The answer is, I really don't know. I thank you for listening and look forward to seeing you again next time.